Hello, everyone. I'm Taylor McEwen, Collections and Exhibitions Curator at the South Dakota Art Museum.
And I'm Abigail Ramsbottom, Curator of Education at the museum.
Yeah, and welcome to the first virtual artist chat featuring artists from the South Dakota Governor's 10th Biennial Exhibition. The Biennial exhibitions aim to recognize and encourage South Dakota artists, to promote the artistic identity of South Dakota, and to foster a larger sense of community and connection among artists within the state. And we're so happy that you've all joined us this morning. The biennials are in large part made possible through generous grant funding from the South Dakota Arts Council. The virtual artist chat is made possible through the generous support of donors like you. Because the South Dakota Art Museum receives operational funding from South Dakota State University and the South Dakota Arts Council, your donations, memberships, and gifts fund fantastic exhibitions and programs like this. Thank you.
All right, and very shortly here, we will hear from 4 artists that are featured in the biennial whose work is on display at the South Dakota Art Museum in Brookings through May 14th. So if you haven't seen the show yet, you still have 2 months to do so. And joining us this morning are artists Sharon Gray, Chris Meyer, Erik Ritter, and Lindsay Twa. Each artist will share about themselves and their artwork, followed by a brief Q&A. So please save your questions for the end of the program, or feel free to put them in the chat throughout and we'll go through those. And I will go ahead and introduce each artist, and then Taylor and I will moderate the Q&A at the end of the program. Without further ado, let's get started. So Sharon Gray will be our first artist, and Sharon has lived in southeastern South Dakota for most of her life. And in her statement, she's noted that she's struck by the rugged beauty of dilapidated corn cribs, rusting grain elevators, abandoned outbuildings, and she is constantly awed by the exquisite beauty of the Missouri River Basin. Sharon came to painting later in life through a serendipitous closeout art supply sale at Augustana University, where she is the Director of Instructional Technology. Now I'll go ahead and share the presentation.
Thank you, Abigail.
Okay. Oh, and I meant to show you all some gallery shots. So just really briefly, we have just a few shots of some of the artists' work, and but really that doesn't compare to the real thing. So I would highly encourage you to come take a visit. Okay, Sharon, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Abigail. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share about my artwork. This particular painting, so Carolyn was saying, what sort of deep, dark secrets can you share that will go on YouTube forever and ever? Well, this one is probably the least representative of my work, and yet it made it into the biennial. So this is much more abstract and loose with color. You know, usually I try to be very accurate. I'm a colorist. I love trying to accurately capture the colors that I'm seeing. And this one, there's some similarity, but it is quite definitely pushing the boundaries a little bit. I mean, you'll see those stripes on the field, you know, that kind of lavender color with the pink, and then the edging around the, you know, trees with the light hitting. Again, not quite as realistic as I tend, but it was fun. It was different to explore a different way of painting. I like stretching myself that way, although I do find that I tend more toward what I'm familiar with. Now, the particular landscape is most definitely something I paint very frequently. I love that I live on the bluff of the Missouri River. Those hills you're seeing in the distance are Nebraska. So I paint the Missouri River Basin frequently in lots of different types of light, lots of different seasons. And it is probably my favorite object, if you want to call it that, to paint. So yeah, that's kind of this one. If you want to go to the next, I'll talk a little bit about the ones that are more reflective of what I tend to do. One of the things that these two pieces together highlight is how much I like dark in watercolor. My watercolors, often people will say they don't look like watercolors, they look like acrylics or they look like photographs. And that's fine, that whatever it is they look like is what they look like. But the reality is I'm just trying to capture the color as I see it, and the light. It's all the light. I love seeing light and trying to accurately capture it on in a painting, on a canvas, on a piece of paper. This one on the left, I probably, one of these days, you'll see on my obit that she died in a tornado, because I never heed the warnings like I should. If I hear a tornado siren, I'm in my car with my camera and driving. And so this one was most definitely a very severe storm, but down at the bottom, that inch at the bottom is the land, and everything else with the clouds in the sky, and it was just spectacular. And I typically will take a photograph or multiple photographs and then go back and paint from those. I do occasionally paint plein air, but I am more comfortable with, since the light is so important to me, I like that the light holds still in a photograph. I will say, though, that painting plein air, those paintings, you can see a difference. You can see they're more alive somehow. And it's because the light is changing while you're painting it. And so there's this kind of almost three-dimensional, immersive effect that comes from painting plein air. I wish I did it more often. I don't have a lot of time to paint, and I wish I made more time to do it and just go out and take my easel. But the one on the right, that is my living room, and that is my living room with the morning light streaming in through that window. And I loved how everything else was extremely, it was hinted at, like you can see the mantle of the fireplace, you can see the kind of blanket over the couch on the far right, and you can see the light behind in the front porch of the trees through the window of the front porch. But it's hinted at, it's that stripe of light across the diagonal from the left that really, is the painting. And it's one of my favorites. This one is actually one of my favorites. So you can go to the next slide now if you want to. The one on the left is my kitchen window. So that was one day I saw the light coming in the morning, and I grabbed my camera, and I loved how it was shining through the various glass items and things that I have in the window, and the plants, rooting and that sort of thing. And then the paintbrushes too, you see over there on the left. One of the things that I try to do is, and this one's a pretty good example of it, I try to paint what I see, not what I think I see, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to paint the colors and the shapes that are really reflected there, and not like, well, I think there's a tree back there, so I should paint a tree. No, there is a tree back there, and this is how the tree looks when I'm capturing it through this, this glass. And I find that to be very fun. That's kind of like a puzzle or a challenge. I really enjoy that aspect of painting. The one on the bottom, that is my second painting. I was so fortunate, like Abigail said in the intro, to run across a really good sale on paint supplies at Augustana when they were closing out. And so the very first painting I did in watercolor, I had exquisite, Arches paper. I had these beautiful sable brushes. I had a very limited palette of paint, which I think was a good thing. I think if I had too many colors, it would have made it overwhelming. As it was, I had some nice burnt umber, and I had some nice cerulean blue, and some ultramarine, and I think some, some nice grays, like a Davies gray and a Payne's gray. But I didn't have a large palette of color to start with. And so this painting was an attempt to capture the Missouri River. These are the Nebraska hills. So this is standing on the bridge that crosses between South Dakota and Nebraska, and taking a picture from there, looking east. And it's one that is one of my favorites. In fact, it's kind of, I use it in my business cards. I use it on my website as my front page, my splash entry page, because I love it. And it really reflects the kind of painting that I enjoy and the subject matter that I enjoy. So yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell. I hope I kept under my 10 minutes. Don't cut anybody else short.
No, thank you, Sharon. And as we mentioned, if you have questions in particular for Sharon, you can throw those in the chat and we'll all come together for a conversation at the end. So next up, we'll be hearing from Chris Meyer. Christopher Meyer is a native of South Dakota. He received his BFA in sculpture from USD in December of 2000 and his MFA with an emphasis in sculpture from the University of Montana, Missoula. Christopher is an assistant professor at the University of South Dakota, and his teaching interests are in all forms of sculpture, including representational, abstract, and non-objective work, both historical and contemporary. And Chris?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, my name is Chris Meyer. I do teach sculpture at USD. I'm an alum from USD as well. I'm a native South Dakotan. Yeah. So the work that I have in the Governor's Biennial this time around was a copper casting that was created through a reaction casting. Since I've started heavily into iron, maybe in the last decade or so, I've gotten into performance art casting. Sometimes they generate an artifact from the event and sometimes they don't. This is one of the fortunate times that I did get an artifact from these. So these are cast into ice. This is how I made this piece. I purchased some 30-gallon translucent drum liners, and then they're heavy plastic. And then I fill those, sometimes I put 2 of those sleeves together and then fill them up with about 110 pounds, 120 pounds of ice cubes. And then pour the liquid metal through that. And what's casting then is the negative space between the ice. So it's kind of organically finding its way through. This copper is a very highly conductive material in terms of heat. And I can get away with this without causing some sort of explosion most of the time because of something called the linen frost effect. So the metal is so hot that it is causing kind of a vapor barrier between actual moisture interacting with the liquid metal. So all you really get from this is a very mellow, smooth kind of performance. It's not dramatic or sparky or anything like that. There's a little bit of steam, a little bit of sound of water melting and trickling from it. So it's very counter to a lot of the other performances that I end up making. This one reacted beautifully with the ice and got an amazing finish. This is all just reduction of the surface natural patinas that came out of the process of casting this. The very next one that I poured in sequence with this was completely just copper colored. No coloration at it at all. Looked like a shiny copper penny. If you want to go to the next slide, we can watch this video that I have of the actual process of this. This is with bronze, not copper. But I was practicing these techniques, all kinds of different metals to see what kinds of results I would get for national performances I was going to be doing with that. Most metal performances are very visually, full, and this is too, but in a more subtle, slower way. It's kind of like watching a weld like cool off. It can happen right before your eyes. And the nice thing about these is that I could then right now, while they're still hot, dump these out and show them to the audience, the results right at that immediate, moment of them being finished. If you want to move to the next slide. This is another piece that was done this way recently, but this is with iron. So these are 2 pieces of cast cast iron that were done at the same time. And I don't know, I've been collecting different stands. This is an old cast iron, I think an angle or a bench grinder stand. I find these stands and I collect them. And that's kind of what I'm placing these objects on right now. Trying to find something that's utilitarian, maybe has a connection to it, but then put these very organic shapes. They almost look like coral or something like that on the surface. So many negative shapes, so many different hues and colors. And it's amazing to me that something as industrial a material as iron can become as light and airy and flowy, like a cloud almost, through this process. I'm really interested in those extremes of elements coming together, ice and like liquid metals. What will happen when you put those two extreme things in the same place? If you want to move to the next slide. This is another type of reaction. This is actually the first performance casting reaction mold that I ever did. And this was in Decorah, Iowa, at a friend's iron pour that he has every summer. I was casting into a naturally hollowed log. So I had collected a bunch of eastern red cedar logs that were naturally hollowed. And then I capped the bottom of them with a steel plate and then poured molten iron into them. This was probably the largest explosion reaction that I had up to, well, it's the first one I did. It was huge. And it's the biggest one I had for a long time. It probably blasted, I don't know, 100 feet into the air, probably about 70 feet wide around us, you know, raining down in iron. Pretty amazing. And then this is the result that I got from that, which, you know, at the time of doing that, you can't really see it yourself because you're pouring it. You're focused completely on making that event happen. And then it's all blowing up around you and you don't really get to see the spectacle. But then later on, as the log burns away and reveals the casting that's left inside, I felt even more gratified maybe that I got this kind of a result from something like that. Again, I get this really lacy textured surface. The colors that come from this are natural from the reduction of the iron as it's cooling off and burning off the wood that contained it. And it is a casting of what that younger tree looked like, the heartwood of that tree. So my intent with all of these pieces, I've been casting these for over 10 years now, is to make enough of them where I can create a shelter belt installation space and talk about, the degradation of our environments, the necessity to cut down every little bit of anything to plant a little bit of more something, you know, and there's a lot of loss of habitat. And so I guess it's a little bit of an environmental statement through these works. You can see the wood grain in them. They almost look like a petrified tree to me in some ways. Anyway, so that's another type of reaction. If you want to move forward to the next slide. I also do things that are kind of ridiculous. I guess all of this is somewhat silly. It's fun to play with these elements, but I was fortunate enough to come across a whole bunch of pipe organs from an organ that was being disassembled. And so I started making these reaction molds that uses the exhaust gases to play the organ pipes. So I'm starting to create music with these pieces. This is the largest reaction mold I've ever made. It was quite large. It was as part of our performance that I hosted a national conference at USD this last fall. I'm a board member on the Western Cast Iron Art Alliance, and we had an iron carnival in Prentice Park, where we had all kinds of games and rides and foods, and then that tailored into a big performance board that we had in the park as well, with all kinds of sparky things, reactions and whatnot. And this was my finale caboose piece for that. It's kind of shaped like a caboose. If you want to go to the next, this is a video. You can play that, and if you're quiet, or you might lean in, and you can probably hear the sound of this. Sorry about all the screaming. Yeah, so I don't know, it's kind of amazing. I've been making these molds and playing with the ideas of what the exhaust represented for a long time. I went to graduate school out in Missoula, Montana. I would drive past Billings all the time and other refinery sites, and seeing the burn off from the refineries kind of inspired me to make some work that talked about our use of fuels. It's kind of ironic because I'm doing this in the middle of an iron pour at the same time when we're burning coke as our fuel. But then when I stumbled upon these organ pipes, it made me think about, well, could I use this exhaust, to create sound as well? So to make a more full experience, I guess, for these performances. And I've really enjoyed playing with them. In fact, I just last summer got, probably around over a ton, maybe 3,000 pounds of organ pipes and organ parts from an art center in Cannon Falls, Minnesota. So I'm set. I can do this for another 10 years at least to play with these things. I do enjoy them. They're quite fun. So I've gotten to travel all across the country doing these performances. I'm getting ready to go to Birmingham, Alabama in about 2 weeks, and I'll do a performance down there for the National Conference on Cast Iron Art, Contemporary Practices. You want to go to the next slide, please? That'd be great. So this is another silly reaction. This is probably the craziest thing I ever do. I've never done it any place other than Sioux Falls. And this is still on the way up. All these sparks are on the way up. I do a performance pour up in Sioux Falls at the Bronze Age Art Foundry. I have a former student that works there, and he started a business called Nordic Iron. And they have a solstice pour every winter. And this year, I did this piece where I create a conical shaped mold. And then I have some cast iron apples, like this one here. Got a bite out of it. That I have a long delivery device. It's basically like a little pot with a really long, like 16 feet handle on it. And I put that apple in there with a little water, so it's nice and cold and saturated wet. And I dump that into a mold full of liquid iron, and it's shaped like a cone. So as it explodes with the cavitation reaction, it really projects it all way sky high. This was the largest one that I've ever blasted. I think I'm gonna not go as big ever again, but it's kind of a spectacle. For me, might be a little cathartic too. I'm a survivor from a high conduction voltage injury and was burned a lot, 25% of my body, 3rd and 4th degree burns. Anyway, so I don't know, for me, it's like being in that moment again. I don't have any memory from that incident that happened. And I kind of wonder what was going on at that moment that I lost. I don't remember about 2 weeks of that whole experience. So maybe some of the reasons I do this is to kind of try to find some of that again. I don't know why. The spectacle is pretty amazing. And I think most of the audience really gets into that. For me, there's that moment and there's power in that because it's something that you can't own. It's something that you can only take with you and experience. And that no one can really ever take that away from you. So I think there is real power in something that is experiential based. I think I have one last slide left to show you. This is another result. So this is, again, casting iron into ice, but this time I was carving into basically large clear blocks of ice that we'd use for carving ice, like swans or whatever, as a centerpiece in a banquet or something like that. So very clear ice, and then pouring the iron into it and being able to see everything that was happening, all the interactions, not ice cubes where you have all this frosted surface in front of you, but you could see clarity like looking through a pane of glass, that interaction bubbling away. And this was, as it burned in, we poured probably too much metal into it. It made this kind of globby thing, very organic. And I struggled probably for a couple of years to figure out what I was going to do, if I was going to do anything with this clunk of iron. But I kind of started thinking about, extremes of things. So this very organic shape paired with something much more structured, much more linear, much more rectilinear. I think it kind of pairs those two extremes, symbolize those extremities, I guess, in my work. I don't just do things like this too. I make traditional objects. I work with all kinds of different materials in my practice: woodworking, carving, felted wool, kind of whatever the piece needs to be made out of is what I enjoy working with the best. What I like so much about metal and casting in particular is the community. Every time I travel, I just got back from New Mexico a couple of weeks ago. I was down there, brought a dozen students with me and a couple of former students with me. It's like that every time you go someplace. It's kind of like a family reunion. You're getting to see these people that you come together and you practice these things together. They become like a family unit to a certain extent. The community is very strong, very accepting. There's so many diverse personalities and people in it. It's surprising. Took a while for me to realize that was the thing that was I'm most attractive about it. Most artists, I'm guilty of it too, are pretty content hermitating in our studios by ourselves with their own thoughts. I spend a lot of my time that way as well, but it does a soul good to get out and share these things, and these performance things, you can document them, but it's not the same as actually experiencing it. It's the same thing when you look at an image of art. It's not the same thing being in front of it in person. There's so much nuance and detail that you can get out of that experience. So bringing people together, and it's been a while. This is, I haven't traveled anywhere since the pandemic. So I'm finally starting to get back out there again, and it feels great. So I guess that's kind of an explanation of some of my performative work. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. And if you have questions, we'll get back to Chris very shortly. So next is Erik Ritter, and Erik is a visual artist and lo-fi space rock alchemist who's been creating one-of-a-kind pop genre collaborations for the last 20 years. However, as a visual artist, he has exhibited during Art Basel Week in Miami, Scope International in New York, and most recently at the Diego Rivera Gallery in San Francisco. And currently, Erik is also an instructor at South Dakota State University School of Design.
Did I send you that intro?
I got it off your website.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Cool. Fun. All right. Yeah, I'm Erik with the K, the more Nordic masculine spelling. I'm just going to vomit these things out there, these ideas, and then you can take them and hopefully there'll be little seeds that you can think about. So first I want to share a story about Joe Stewart, the former director of the South Dakota Art Museum. He was also an instructor when I was an undergrad, and I was on a field trip at the Walker Art Center with Joe and lots of other students. And the exhibit was Alexander Calder was the featured artist at the Walker, and we were all kind of huddled around one of his smaller sculptures, kind of made of wire and metal. We know Alexander Calder, and they're mobiles and they move, and we're sitting around, and Joe's telling us a little bit about it, and he takes a long look to the right and takes a long look to the left, and then he spins the mobile that was on the pedestal at the Walker. We all kind of just gasped, and that probably was the most formative thing that I learned in undergrad from Joe Stewart and from any of my instructors, is that not only are these things precious, valuable masterpieces of art, but they're also just wire and metal, and that duality of not taking things too seriously, but also taking them totally seriously. So you can see that part of that in why I use these cheap, some might say low art materials, found objects, and some might even say kitsch. I don't care, doesn't matter. And also the duality of the title, Propane Britannia or Sappho Kardashian and the Neurotoxic Liar. I like to give the viewer a choice, and also I don't like to give too much. So what I like to say with this is that the key to unraveling the mystery of the title and the way to look at the work lies within the title, and that's a reference to the movie Contact. And I'm very obsessed with films, and then that also coincides with this series that this is a part of. This is part of a series called the Sci-Fi series, and you might notice that this kind of might look like a spaceship as well. There were other pieces that had titles like JTK 1138, which is a reference to James T. Kirk, and 1138 from George Lucas's THX 1138. Another title was Ripley 8 Yellow. That's a reference to the film franchise Aliens. Very obsessed with Star Wars. The Death Star and those first models, when they made the first Star Wars, are assembled in a similar way. And that wasn't by design on my part. I realized that I was actually doing Star Wars as I was making these. Just one day I was like, wow, this really looks like the Death Star. And I didn't even try to do that. But I was so obsessed with Star Wars as a kid, and still am. My son's name is Lucas for a reason. And yeah, so I think we can go to next slide. Thank you. So some of my influences, other things that have shaped my ideas. In 2018, I went to the Guggenheim and saw Hilma af Klint's exhibit. And I went into the Guggenheim. I was in New York for the first time. Unfortunately, that was my first time. And I had never heard of her before. And when I walked into this temple, all the mythology behind the Guggenheim lived up to the hype. I had seen so many films and documentaries about Frank Lloyd Wright and how he built it and why he made all these different choices. And it was just this almost metaphysical experience just to be in the Guggenheim for the first time. And then to see these paintings, just being confronted with these paintings that I had never heard of before, it was almost too much to take. So we'll see some references to Hilma here in some of the work coming up. All right, so this is another thing. I don't do as much painting. This is a larger scale work, roughly 4 by 6 feet. This is called Time Travel as Brushstrokes, or Energy, Frequency, and Vibration. And this has some of the symbology that I'm interested in currently. Very obsessed with the hexagon as a shape. I saw a documentary about how the hexagon is used in nature. There's a beach in Ireland called Giant Causeway, and this lava went into the ocean and it formed these hexagon slabs. Some of you may have seen it before. Check it out, Giant Causeway. And in that documentary, the narrator talked about how nature is lazy, and that clicked for me. It's like, okay, we're gonna use that to our good. So I'm started bringing the hexagon into my work. I'm also doing found object sculpture in hexagons, so they can be used alone, or ideally for a large scale piece where I can connect them, because the hexagon shape connects better than any other shape that we know of so far, until we discover the 5th and 6th dimension. We'll find out about that later. I'm interested in the idea of magic in nature, and the idea of normalizing magic, and that connects to Hilma. She was, a spiritualist. She believed that she was talking to spirits, and I work in a very intuitive way. This is an intuitive painting. The found object pieces, they have, you know, there's a focus in the end, but as I'm assembling them, it's all intuitive. I try to not think too much. And when I'm teaching students on campus, I'll say similar things to them when they're drawing. Observe more, think less. Just feel it, intuit as you're working. All right, move on to the next, please. All right, this is a current piece, one of the more current pieces. You can see the hexagons in there. There's a big one in the middle triptych and 2 on either side. And if you look closely on the outside panels, you can see a reference to Hilma in the shapes. And I know you won't be able to see this very well, but it's this painting here. If you look at those side panels, kind of a reference to her. I didn't plan that. As I was going through my objects, I saw them and I was like, well, those need to be included. So this one is called Megalopolis, or Wherever You Go, There You Are. I'm also very interested in time travel, which is, as we saw in the last piece, brushstrokes as time travel. Whenever we're doing a piece of art, and this kind of is adjacent to Chris's work before, you know, we're sharing energy. Brushstroke is a documentation of energy. And I'm very interested in how I live with people, how I share my energy, how the energy comes off the piece, things like that. This is also an attempt to connect old religious iconography in the triptych, then also with the new science of quantum physics, the hexagon, fractal universe, time travel, wherever you go, there you are, things like that. Trying to get them all together in a glorious cocktail, so to speak. And I think we got a little bit more. And then recently, I realized I have a lot in common, not all things in common, but some things in common with Tom Sachs. He just got some really bad press, so we won't talk about that. But he also uses kind of mundane, cheap materials, and he's interested. He does mock-ups of full-scale mock-ups of the lunar lander, but makes them out of plywood, things like that. So I just thought that was fun to include that. Then we can go down to that last slide. And this is an example of the Kushlov effect in film. So when you have film as a sculpture in time, you're putting clips together. And if you have, depending on the different things that are between 2 clips, that will change the story. So this is an example of, you have the same reaction on the left of this gentleman, but if we cut to a different object or a different clip, that will change the story. And I feel that relates directly to how people can interpret my artwork. If you run your eyes across the artwork and the objects will tell different stories in the ways that they are put together, how they're smashed next to each other. For example, on the propane Britannia, if I was to swap out one of those objects and put a toothbrush in there, that's going to tell a different story. And in some weird way, Henry Ford said every object tells a story. I don't know how that relates to Henry Ford, but he said it, and it totally relates to me. So I also look at the artwork kind of like looking at a film. It's just in general, I feel like creating is really all the same thing. If you're drawing, making music, in a play, there are all very similar elements of repetition, contrast, dynamics. They all come into play. no matter what you're creating. And just one last thing. So the thing I'm working on right now, I'm doing a sculpture that's going outside the St. Paul Saints Stadium for opening month. Just a pop-up sculpture. I will deliver that on March 30th. That's one of 16 sculptures with other artists in the Twin Cities and around. And I'm excited about that. I've got a lot of work to do. It's not finished yet, but that'll be fun. So thanks for letting me ramble.
Thanks so much, Erik. All right, we'll hop to Lindsay to finish us off. So Lindsay Twa is a printmaker, curator, and art historian. She's the director of the ID Dalrymple Gallery at Augustana University, where she's also professor of art in the Department of Art and Anthropology and chair of the Humanities Division.
Great, well, thanks. Abigail, you can go ahead and forward the first slide. So yeah, so I wear a lot of different hats in my roles here at Augustana. But one of the hats that I wear that I think feeds my soul the most is as a practicing artist. And as Abigail said, my practice has been mostly focused on printmaking. I work predominantly in techniques of stone lithography, intaglio etching, and relief printing in woodcuts, and also hips engraving, which is using the tools and techniques of 19th century wood engraving, but actually carving on high impact polystyrene plastics. What connects all of my work across the various mediums and techniques is that I see myself as a visual storyteller. So I retell, represent, or really represent myths through an environmentalist and feminist perspective. And I also create images that I hope encourage viewers to create their own new narratives. So I typically do this through human, animal, and natural forms that are anchored in observational drawing, but then I hope to alter for expressive purposes. So in the slide, you see me next to one of my large, at that time, in-progress woodcuts, which was called Thief in the Night. And here I'm hoping that the viewer might think of the various personalities of the animals in creating a story about what the cot mouse has done. And the mouse is modeled after the famous high Renaissance master printer Albrecht Dürer's mouse, which appeared under the foot of Adam in Dürer's image of Adam and Eve at the Tree of Knowledge. The image on the right is an engraving called Daphne's Story, and it's a representation of the Greek tale of Daphne being turned into a laurel tree to save her from the untoward advances of the god Apollo. And the original tale was certainly not told from Daphne's perspective. And so I began with the question, what might it look like if it was told from the perspective of the trees? I mean, surely Daphne was not alone, nor was she the only one. So did she find empathy and support? Did her story continue? I certainly hope so. But essentially, the passing down of stories often fixes a narrative to one viewpoint. And this is repeated not just in the telling, but also in how it comes to be represented. So if you look closely, you might notice that the figures are actually modeled after the Italian Baroque sculptor Bernini's version of this tale. But the forest is, in contrast, is inspired by the 19th century landscape paintings of Asher B. Durant, who was a member of the Hudson River School. And Durand worked during a period when the American wilderness was really coming to the fore as a subject matter for landscape painting, but one at the exact same time when the wilderness was being lost to both deforestation and settler cultivation. So I altered the trees to become Daphne's support. You'll see sort of female forms within the trees, with the thought that maybe we can reclaim a lost voice just as we might work to preserve our own environment. If you want to go to the next slide, Abigail. So over the past few years, in part, partly driven by studio closures with COVID, I've been starting to look towards a more drawing practice, with drawings being not just preliminary images for prints, but finished works unto themselves. And here I've been thinking about how we define certain plants as weeds in a derogatory sense that encourages their elimination, whereas in their native environments, they are cornerstone species for preserving the soil through long taproots and supporting native species. So I began by thinking about what should my role be in supporting such species as an urban gardener in South Dakota. And I began drawing the entire life cycle of all the plants, such as coneflower, milkweed, even dandelions, and the insects and pollinators that they support. And this COVID focus on drawing actually led to the work that I have in this year's Governor's Biennial. So you can go ahead. Yep, thanks. And so last summer I had continued working through drawings in part because they allowed me to work on a larger scale than my more intricate engravings have been doing. But I had intended to start on a new cycle of prints. And my drawing that is in the Governor's Biennial can probably be best summed up with the phrase, sometimes an artwork just asks to be made. Now, there's the stereotypical assumption that all artists sit around and wait for a lightning bolt of inspiration, and then they get to work. But most scientific studies of creativity suggest that that's not really how it works if you're actually looking to have a long-term practice in a creative career. Rather, lifelong creative people put in the time day in, day out. They exercise their creativity by getting to work on a regular basis because the idea for the next work is almost always a leftover question from the previous work. And as an art educator here at Augustana University, we really try to inculcate that it's the habits of what it means to be a creative practitioner. And we really work to try to dispel notions that creativity is just this is an outside force gifted occasionally by the muse of inspiration to just a select few. And rather it is the habit of creativity that actually carries the day. But on occasion, that lightning bolt does occur. So last summer, as I was trying to get a new series of prints off the ground, I saw a call for art from the Center for Western Studies on the theme of horses of the plains. And I instantly saw in my mind this piece. The image came to me, though it came to me was so strong that I had to immediately pursue it. And now I've had this experience on a few occasions before, this feeling of this utmost urgency about an image. And I've learned that if I don't work on the image right then, or at least make some sketches or write down some ideas, if I wait to come back to it, sometimes the moment has passed and the image no longer speaks. So this image completely derailed the start of a new series of prints, and I'm so thankful that it did. So my subject matter really layers ideas of the historical territory of South Dakota with autobiography. So first, the introduction of the horses to the Upper Great Plains absolutely transformed the culture and history of Native Americans. The horse is now thoroughly a part of the epic narrative of the Upper Great Plains and has absolutely shaped the identities of those who call this geography home. But it is also a history that is rife with contradictions. And for those of you who are interested, there's a lot of actually new scholarship by historians who are analyzing the realities and myth-making of the rise and fall of horse cultures on the plains. And I'd be happy to share my footnotes with you, if anyone who's interested. So that was in part driven by my inclusion of the Appaloosa mare and the Mustang stallion as a nod to these place-based histories and myth-making. But behind this is also a personal story. So I am born and raised an urban kid, but I've always been a horse crazy girl. So from the moment I acquired language, I was asking, well, really nagging my family for a horse. And the best my family could do to sage me was to give me toy horses. So each birthday and Christmas, my herd grew little by little. And I could spend hours hidden in my room, playing with them, making my own bridles and tack, making my own environments. And in my mind, I was racing them over the northern plains, and these stories were just endless that they told me. So some of you on the call here might be familiar with Breyer model horses, the little plastic horses. So the Appaloosa and Mustang are indeed drawn from life, but they're drawn from these specific Breyer models, which I still own. And my youngest son served as my live model for the boy. So I worked drawing them from life. For me, which is a relatively fairly large drawing. The frame piece is 30 by 38 inches. And I began first with fairly naturalistic renderings of my son. But as the drawing progressed, I increasingly refined the horses while actually simultaneously erasing away the boy. And I was asking the question, what is more real, the little plastic horses or the boy? And perhaps in a very heavy-handed, fairly nostalgic way, I want the viewer to arrive at the conclusion that imagination is actually more real than life. So to emphasize this, I actually also took a little trick from a mid-20th century painter named Ad Reinhardt. Okay, so you can't take the art historian completely out of me. The problem for artists is that on average, and there's studies that show this, the typical museum's viewer spends 13 seconds. Some studies even say worse 7 seconds in front of a work of art before moving on. And Ad Reinhardt began a series of what he called the black paintings in the mid-20th century, where he'd paint black squares, but then would, into his black pigment, would add 1 or 2 drops of red or green or blue. And if the viewer only stands in front of his paintings for 7 seconds, all they basically see is a huge hovering black square. If, however, the viewer stands for a minute, they're rewarded by the retinal adjustment of their eyes, and that will then form colors and see the forms based off of the color perception, but that needs time for the eyes to first adjust. So sort of similarly, my horses are not just only the most resolved aspect of the drawing, but I've also included a light layer of color through oil pencils underneath. And this makes the horses come forward even more and be even more real for those who might take the time to see them and return us or me to really the important time spent in imaginative play. So I'm just thrilled to be part of the exhibition, and hopefully we have still a little bit of time for some questions and discussion.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much, Lindsay. And we do have time. Before I close out the presentation, I just want to remind you all, if you're available next week, we'll have another slate of artists at the same time, 10:30 a.m. Central. And if you signed up and registered today, you'll get an email for that, as you've already registered for this whole series.
Yeah, Amanda is asking, do you have one piece that you believe defines you or your style?
No.
I'm going to steal from Frank Lloyd Wright. He always said, the next one.
Yeah.
Nice.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
Jamie.
Yeah.
Yep.
I want to ask Chris, that stuff looks really dangerous out there walking in the fire like that. Is that
You asked my question.
dangerous, or what's the deal?
Is it dangerous?
Yeah.
Well, sure, it's a little dangerous. You have to be pretty geared up to participate in a metal pour anyway. And then if you're doing performance work, you take some extra precautions. So the gear I have a back cover to protect my neck. Sometimes I wear a face mask underneath things if I'm going to be really in the stuff. Yeah, and you dress in a way that anything that lands on you kind of sheds off like a roof and give anything little possibilities of getting caught places. That said, are burns common? Yes, I've had many of them. They're just little kisses from the furnace. It's like when you work with metal, you know, and you're a welder, you get burned every once in a while. It's part of it. You just never want to put yourself in a situation where something catastrophic can happen. So,
But the photos really look dramatic, you know, like you're walking through fire, like, you know, like in a volcano or something like that, you know.
Yeah, it's splattering down all around me. Yeah. My leathers are quite speckled up with lots of little burns on them, you know. Yeah, I'd rather have that get burned than me underneath. But yeah.
And that kind of, so my question was going to be, do you have to have special insurance when you have these public pours? How does that work?
Yes, sometimes we do have to have insurance. We have liability waivers that everybody has to sign no matter what, whether we're doing a performance with, you know, purposefully kind of crazy things, or we're just doing a straight production pour where nothing's supposed to, you know, spew into the air or anything like that. Everybody still signs a liability waiver. You participate in these things on your own accord. So, yeah, it does make me nervous. Like if something ever happened bad at an event that I'm hosting, sure, absolutely. It is something to be aware of. I travel with a burn kit all the time when I go to these things, just in case. There's people that play with like a thermite for some of these reactions. You know, they're making all kinds of things, playing with, I don't know, fuels, even gunpowder and some of these things. I'm not quite that crazy. I don't want to create a bomb that's going to, you know, send shrapnel into the audience or anything like that. So yeah.
I got a question for you. So Can you talk more about the difference between, you know, you're doing a performance and then you have a result of that performance? And how do you look at the object versus the
Sure.
show that you're giving, so to speak?
So sometimes I make work that is intentional to get a result from an artifact from the process. With those trees, specifically that Shelter Belt series, it's twofold. There's a duality to it. It is partially the spectacle of the event and the moment happening, but then also the result. Yeah, I don't know if there's a huge relationship. Other than that, I can't get those same sorts of results through a regular refractory material and making a mold, without it being way more intricate in process wise. I could create a wax maybe of something like that and do it in a ceramic shell, but it would have no soul to it. It wouldn't interact with the way that the metal is being introduced to it. There wouldn't be that dialogue that happens, which results in the experience, the spectacle of it all.
Yes, the spectacle. Okay.
You know, it's like being, I have a lot of friends who are potters, and they make work and they put it in a kiln and they fire it up to very high temperatures, hot enough to melt wood ash, you know, but you don't get to see that. You don't get to see that part of the process. And for me, I've always wanted to be closer to the fire, so to speak, to be, what would it be like to be inside the kiln with the pots as they're being fired? What would that experience be like? Iron and performance casting has given me a means to get a little bit closer to what that experience would be like.
Closer to nature, would you say?
I don't know, nature, an edge of something. I mean, some of this performance stuff and things that we're making, you are kind of skating an edge to a certain degree, maybe not always in terms of the way everyone thinks with danger, but on a conceptual level too. You know, some of the things that we make, I don't know, if you do it long enough, it can feel a little bit gimmicky, maybe, perhaps. Maybe not from somebody seeing this from the outside for the first time, not so, but you do start to see things repeat themselves. And maybe it could be a gimmick. I don't know. For me, it's a personal.
Don't crawl in a
yeah.
kiln.
I won't.
Okay.
No desire to burn up that way. No.
Words to live by. Don't crawl in a kiln.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, like when I felt wool or do other processes that are very hands-on, tedious, monotonous, you know, I really enjoy working those processes too. It gives my mind a chance to wander and develop other thoughts and think about ideas, sometimes based on what I'm doing and sometimes not. It's almost the opposite of that with the performance work. I put all this effort into creating this object, and then if I'm pouring it, which is normally the case, you don't ask somebody else to do those things for you, you don't get to see any of it. So I'm still incredibly focused, but I don't get to wander. I don't get to see it. Once in a while, I've made a piece with like a ramp that I pour down, and then I can actually take my eyes off of what I'm doing and watch the reaction, which has been quite an amazing event every time I've gotten to see that. But most of the time you're laser focused on what you're doing. And so you don't really even get to see the result of everything that's going on around you. You know, it's through documentation, which is really important. I preach that to my students all the time. You should be documenting your process, no matter what it is that you're doing, whether it's in the studio or finished work or along the way. When you have talks like this, you know, it gives you so much more fuel to talk about your ideas and to talk about, you know, where you're going and how things got there.
And it's all art anyway. Like the process is art. And
I think that is the art for me. The process of making, you know, of creating work, that's the artwork. The byproduct, the artwork that comes out of that, you know, that's a byproduct. It's not really the art for me. It's not the reason I make it. It's not to make an object. I'm an object maker, but I want the experience of making it. That's the important.
Okay. That's why I asked about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I intuitively related to that, you know, like the object is a documentation of energy. I don't think it's any different than if someone's doing a drawing, you know, energy is being released. You're working with energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the object, the result, the artifact is important as, you know, a record of that, as the thing that we as artists and historians, you know, speak of and communicate about. But Vasari probably was trying to get closer to what the truth was about the thing, the life of the artist, you know, the thing that they're interested in, the things that they are, you know, working on. That's the real art. To me.
And I was going to chime in there that, Lindsay, I really appreciated what you said about how your work as an art historian informs your, you know, process. I thought that was brilliant. I really appreciate that.
Thanks. Yes, I think we, you know, kind of understand that our teachers are not just the whatever masters we learned from in the classroom. It's the whole history that's gone before us, and you can beg, borrow, and steal ideas from anywhere. You know, even past centuries are just as important, and maybe more speak to us more now than maybe, you know, a few decades ago type of thing.
But I think, and I want to add that hearing you describe that and describe the influences makes me appreciate what I'm seeing all the more, because, you know, it really is very helpful to have that kind of awareness brought to you. No, and so thank you for that.
Thanks. I'm not so heavy-handed. I think most of us aren't so heavy-handed that we expect our viewers to pick up on all of those things, but all of those things, you know, I think keep, you know, our heads in the game as well.
And Chris, just like you were saying, don't go in a kill, I'm going to say, don't go out in tornadoes. Don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do.
I mean, do you feel pretty alive though when you're in all of that energy, that moment?
I love the way storms feel and smell and look. Yes. And even some of that electricity that you feel when you realize you're way too close to a lightning strike. Yeah.
Being on an edge.
Happened to me once. I was really close to a lightning strike. I'm pretty sure it hit the building that I live in, and it knocked me to my knees.
Yeah. No, it's not good stuff. It's worth it to me. And I don't know what that says about me, but I'm afraid it says something kind of dire. But it is definitely, I can't live any other way. My kids get after me a little bit and, you know, try to tell me, Mom, no, please go inside. Take cover. Let's go to the basement.
To put this out to anybody, if anybody out there is interested in seeing one of these experiences, I guess on June 17th in Sioux Falls, there will be an iron pour at Bronze Age art casting that I'll be involved with as well. And then I host an event at my home studio out in rural Vermillion called The Little Pour on the Prairie. And that's going to be the next weekend on the 24th of June. So if you are interested, you can email me, ask for more details. It's chris.meyer@usd.edu. It's a good time. Usually have people from all over the place that come and help participate in this. And I do run a little workshop for my pour ahead of time. If somebody wanted to try to make something, you know, for the pour, that's something that we do too. It's not just all performance, we make objects too.
And June must be a really good month for art because I want to put in a plug for the river honoring ceremony that we're going to have at the Missouri River, Clay County Park, and there'll be a plein air painting opportunity in the afternoon. So if anyone's interested, they can certainly reach out to me and I'll bring them in on that. But yeah, it's there'll be music and potluck and all sorts of things in the evening, but then during the afternoon, and a kayak, I think there's a kayak float also, but there will be a plein air painting opportunity on June 11th.
Wonderful. Well, Lindsay, I had a question for you, and I think you kind of answered it, but I was interested. I mean, you did mention a lot of historical figures, and I'm wondering if there are contemporary artists that you feel really inspired by or that you pull from.
Sure, great question. I think the most immediate one that comes to mind is the artist printmaker Joanna Mueller, who is an artist in Colorado. She does really refined, high-impact polystyrene engravings that tell these full narratives of animals and stories, but she's she's a very meticulous printmaker, but then she's also 21st century artist in the sense that she doesn't have to have a perfect exact edition. Then she does a lot of collage work and layered work and then painting on top of her prints. So using both the traditions of printmaking and then turning those on their heads, but she does her imagery really through these spirit animal type of forms. And I think I find I'm drawn particularly to those works for sure. I have lots of other artists, but it's like sort of like an art historian. You can't, pick just one. So I'll just land with that. Joanna Mueller out of Colorado.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm going to Google her. And Sharon, I had a question for you. So, you mentioned that you came to art a little bit later, but I mean, you do really interesting things with light and dark. And I'm wondering what your relationship to art was before you were making art. Were you going to museums? Were you looking at artwork?
That's a really good question. I have, so I have always been, I've always drawn and, with pencil and that sort of thing, and was a composite fine arts minor for my undergrad degree. So I have had art, and I ended up, though, really just relying on sketching as being my main way of being an artist. And even that, I have 7 children. And so in the midst of having a job and raising family, I have what I call my sleeping baby series. And so while the babies are sleeping, I have lots of drawings of them because they were holding still. But it really wasn't until I was in my, well, I guess it would have been mid-late 40s when that sale happened. So trying to think now, yeah, I would have been about 46, I guess. And that was life-changing. And I am very grateful to Augie Bookstore for going out of the art supply business at the time it did, because it did allow me to have this wealth of materials at a very low price. Each of the items cost 25 cents a piece. So I had tubes of watercolor paint for 25 cents. Arches, huge pages of Arches watercolor paper, 25 cents. And I ended up spending $150 on 25-cent items. And at that point realized I was either going to be a hoarder or I was going to be a watercolor painter. so I started painting, and yeah, have not looked back. I'm very, very grateful for that. But thanks for that question. Oh, wonderful. Sleeping Babies, Karen Kinder has also drawn.
And Lynette says in the chat, great presentations. Looking forward to viewing all these pieces again in the gallery and for more than 7 seconds.
Well, thank you for a great presentation. Are there any last minute questions? If not, I just want to say thank you to Sharon, Chris, Erik, and Lindsay for giving your time today and sharing about yourself and your work. This has been such fun.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
Thanks so much. And before you hop off, I just want to reiterate, we got 3 more of these coming next week, March 30th, and then we'll take a little break, and then we'll have 2 more, April 20th and April 27th. So if you want to keep speaking to amazing artists across the state, please join us. And if you're in Brookings this weekend on Saturday, we have our free community art day from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. and we'll be doing collage with Eileen Binkley. So thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Peace out.
Thank you all.
Take care.